Today in our Whiteboard Leadership Moment, we're talking about change and how people adapt to change. And probably if you're a leader of a church anywhere, you know that some people really hate change and some people really love change. And is there a balance between what we should and shouldn't be doing and challenging our people to do when it comes to change? Back in the 60s, there was a professor, his name was Rogers, and Rogers wrote a huge book called The Diffusion of Innovation. He talked about, it's a behavioral science book, talking about how people adopt change and how they adjust to change. And what he saw was over time that there were different types of people. There were certain people, about 2.5%, 1 person in 40 in American society that are good with change. In fact, they come up with change. And he called those people the innovators. They're the ones that are ahead of everybody else in their thinking, and they innovate. They're very visionary in what they do. And then there were early adopters. Early adopters make up about 13.5% of the population, 1 in 7 or so. And early adopters may not come up with the idea, but the first time they hear it, they're like, yeah, that's it. That's exactly what we need to do. And they're very easy to move toward change. And then there are middle adopters, about 34% of our population. So about 1/3 of the population are middle adopters. Middle adopters don't come up with the idea, and they don't actually accept it as soon as they hear it. They have a few questions. It takes them a little bit of time, maybe a few town halls, maybe a few Q&As or FAQ kind of sheets come out. Maybe there's a few conversations. But after a while, when their questions are answered, they get it. And they say, that makes total sense to me, and I'm on board. It's very often a very short period of time, but not as short as an early adopter. And then there are those late adopters. Another 34% or 1/3 of people in our congregations are late adopters. Those are the people that can't understand, why are we changing? Why are we changing anything? It's working right now. It doesn't make sense to do any kind of change. And so they may not get on board very quickly at all. In fact, some of them may look at you and say, Pastor, listen, I was here before you and I'll be here after you. And they just don't, they're not going to adopt to new change because it takes them a while. And then there's the laggards. The laggards have this motto, we shall not be moved. It doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter what God does. We're simply not going to get on board. And maybe it's because we just don't want to. There's a passage in Luke chapter 5, and Jesus is talking about wineskins. And I believe it's verse 38 of chapter 5. He says, and no one, after tasting the old wine, will want the new, for they'll say, the old is better. That's 16% of the population of your church. Now, here's the thing you need to hear. That means that 1/6 of your church typically doesn't want to change. Which means very often, if you're leading, which is all about change, you're always going to be leaving some people behind. You want to take, though, as many as you can with you. And very often what I've noticed in churches is they leave the late adopters and the middle adopters behind because they're so quick to make so many changes. Let me make some observations about the church. In most cases, when we design communication in the church, it's simply for everything from middle adopter to early adopter to innovator. We don't really think about the sleeping giant over here of the laggards and the late adopters. Churches know they're experiencing this if they look at their giving and realize that only half the people give. Or if they look at their groups and realize only half their people are in small groups. Or they look at any of their activities and realize that less than half of the people are actually on board with whatever activity you're talking about. And the reason this is happening is because you haven't figured out a plan to address the late adopters and the laggards. For example, let's talk about a building campaign. Typically in building campaigns, less than half of the congregation ever makes a commitment to the campaign. And the reason for that is simply this, that most campaigns are 4 to 6 weeks long, and it's simply not long enough for a late adopter to be involved. Now, here's the other piece, is very often the innovators are the ones who are up on stage, and to be honest, these late adopters and laggards think you guys are crazy because you're constantly asking for change, you're constantly asking for more, and they'll say things like this, all they want to do is grow their kingdom, all they want to do is they don't care about us, they care about the church. They're complaining because they simply don't understand, and you haven't given them the time to focus in on it. Here's how you reach a late adopter. You don't let an innovator talk about the change, you let a middle adopter talk about the change. Late adopters think early adopters and innovators are crazy. But they like middle adopters because they're a little more methodical and they typically have relationships with them. And so this is kind of, for example, in a small group scenario, you're at a church that only half the people are in a small group. You would bring someone up on the stage who would be saying something like this, I didn't think small groups were a good idea. When they started announcing that as an opportunity, I didn't get involved. I had a bunch of questions and I wasn't sure, but a friend of mine invited me to a group, and I finally began going to that group, and I began to experience some things. And my wife and I began to experience things in our marriage, we began to experience things in our family, we began to experience things in our heart we never could have experienced without being a part of the small group. I was a skeptic to begin with, but now I am all for small groups, and you should join a small group. When a late adopter hears a middle adopter say that, they're much more likely to come on board. Whereas if an innovator says, listen, everybody just needs to do this, or they should do this, it's very rare. It's very rare that they'll actually get on board with things like that. Hopefully you'll create a plan in your church to grab this sleeping giant of late adopters and middle adopters and make sure that you answer their questions and you give them time to make their decisions. This has been a Converge Whiteboard Leadership Moment. To learn more about Converge or to join us, check out converge.org.